It was supposed to be just another Saturday night, a casual dinner, time spent with friends, laughter, and the comfort of each other's company. Nothing out of the ordinary, nothing to fear. Channon Christian and Christopher Newsom were young, in love, and full of life. They had dreams, plans, a future that stretched out before them like an open road. But that road would never be traveled. As they stood in a parking lot, sharing smiles, lost in the simple joy of being together, they didn't know they were being watched. That someone, no, several someones, had already chosen them. In mere moments their world would shatter, and what awaited them was a nightmare beyond imagination. This is the horrifying true story of the brutal murders of Channon Christian and Christopher Newsom. Before that night, before the fear and the brutality, Channon and Chris were just like any young couple in love. They were full of dreams, laughter, and plans for the future. The kind of couple that made you believe in happiness, in love that felt effortless and real. Channon Christian, just 21 years old, was the kind of person who lit up every room she walked into. She had an energy about her, something that made people feel comfortable, safe, and appreciated. She was a senior at the University of Tennessee, majoring in sociology, driven by a desire to understand people and make a difference in the world. Her friends described her as outgoing, smart, and full of life. She had a laugh that could brighten even the gloomiest day, the kind of laugh that made you smile even if you didn't know what was funny. She was close to her parents, never missing a chance to check in with her mom or dad. She was responsible, reliable, and full of ambition. Channon had dreams of a future, of a career, of a life filled with love and adventure. She had a strong circle of friends who adored her, and she was in a relationship that, by all accounts, was something special. Chris Newsom, 23, was the kind of guy who left an impression on everyone he met. He was an athlete, a former high school baseball star whose talent on the field was undeniable. But beyond his athletic ability, Chris was known for his kindness, his generosity, and his unwavering loyalty to those he cared about. He was the kind of friend who would drop everything to help someone in need, the kind of son who made his parents proud every single day. He had an easygoing, fun-loving personality, the type of person who could make you laugh even when you were having the worst day. He carried himself with quiet confidence, not arrogant, just self-assured. People respected him. They liked him. And when he was with Channon, it was obvious. He adored her. Their relationship was young, but it was full of excitement and hope. They had a chemistry that just worked. They weren't just dating. They were best friends. They made each other laugh, supported each other's dreams, and seemed to bring out the best in one another. When they were together, it was easy to imagine a future for them. Marriage, a family, a lifetime of love. But all of that was stolen in the cruelest way imaginable. January 6th, 2007. It was a cool Saturday night in Knoxville, Tennessee, the kind of night that felt ordinary, uneventful. Channon Christian was at her best friend's apartment, fixing her hair, applying the final touches of makeup, excited for an evening out. Chris Newsom had just arrived to pick her up. He leaned against his truck, hands in his pockets, smiling as he watched her say goodbye to her friends. They were in no rush, just enjoying the moment, soaking in the simple pleasure of being young and in love. They had no idea that, in the darkness just beyond the glow of the parking lot lights, a group of 5 people was watching them. What they didn't know was that, just a few feet away, in the shadows, a group of 5 people was watching them. And these people weren't just looking for a car to steal, they were looking for victims. The attack happened in seconds. A dark figure emerged from the shadows. Then another. Then another. A gun was pulled. Channon gasped, stepping back in shock. Chris moved instantly, instinctively stepping in front of her. He wasn't going to let anyone hurt her, not if he could stop it. But there were too many of them. A struggle, a sharp cry, a brutal hit. Chris was overpowered. Channon screamed as she was grabbed, forced toward her own SUV. A cold hand covered her mouth, a gun pressed against her side. She was shaking, terrified. Chris fought back, struggling against his attackers. He was stronger than them, but not stronger than a gun. He had no choice. Channon had no choice. They were both shoved into the back of the SUV. The doors slammed shut. The engine roared to life, and just like that, they were gone. That was the moment everything changed. They were driven through the quiet streets of Knoxville, the city lights fading into the distance as they entered a darker, more desolate part of town. Chris sat helpless, bound and gagged, forced to watch as Channon trembled beside him. Her eyes were wide with fear. She tried to speak, but her words came out in broken, muffled gasps. The car slowed. They turned onto Chipman Street. The house loomed ahead, 2316 Chipman Street, a rundown, neglected home in an area no one would think twice about, the kind of place where screams could be swallowed by the night. Cut to a chilling image of the house, broken windows, peeling paint, no lights, just darkness. The doors of the SUV swung open. Chris was dragged out first. His feet stumbled on the pavement. Hands pulled at his arms, forcing him forward. Channon followed, her breath coming in short, panicked bursts. She looked around desperately, searching for a neighbor, a light, any sign of life. There was nothing. The door to the house opened. Chris and Channon were pushed inside, and then the door slammed shut. The outside world disappeared, and inside that house, the nightmare began. What happened inside that house is something no human being should ever have to endure. Chris Newsom's final moments were filled with horror no human being should ever have to endure. Bound, helpless, terrified. Inside that house, he was beaten, violated, stripped of his dignity in ways too brutal to fully comprehend. The people who did this had no mercy, no humanity. They inflicted pain without hesitation, without remorse. And then, as if what they had done wasn't enough, they decided Chris had to die. His hands and feet were tied. A sock was shoved into his mouth, gagging him, silencing his cries. A bandana was wrapped tightly around his eyes, blinding him. A dog leash was used to bind his wrists, his captors treating him like nothing more than an animal. He was forced outside, barefoot, the cold air biting at his skin. He stumbled, his body weak from the torture, but they didn't care. They dragged him through the darkness, leading him to the railroad tracks just beyond Chipman Street. There, in the freezing night air, Chris was forced to kneel. The first shot tore through his body, then another, and finally a third, an execution-style bullet to the head. His life ended instantly, but even in death, they showed no mercy. His body was set on fire, a final act of cruelty, as if trying to erase what they had done. For over 24 hours, Channon Christian was trapped inside that house, alone, afraid. She had already lost Chris, but she didn't have time to grieve, to process. Her nightmare was just beginning. She was beaten, violated repeatedly, brutalized in ways too horrific to fully describe. The cruelty she endured was beyond comprehension. Every minute, every hour, her pain grew worse. She begged for it to stop. It didn't. Her captors weren't just ruthless. They were calculated. They knew what they had done to her, and they knew they had to cover their tracks. Bleach. They poured it down her throat, over her body, desperately trying to erase their DNA, to remove any trace of the horrors they had inflicted. But it was too late. They had already stolen everything from her. When they were done, they hogtied her, bound her arms and legs so tightly that escape was impossible. Then, they placed a plastic bag over her head. She struggled. She gasped. She fought for every last breath. And then, in the darkness of that house, she took her final breath. They stuffed her body into a trash can like she was nothing. But she wasn't nothing. She was Channon Christian, a daughter, a friend, a young woman who had her whole life ahead of her. She was just 21 years old. In January 7th, 2007. A railway worker made a grisly discovery. Chris Newsom's burned body was found near the train tracks. His hands and feet bound, his body mutilated, execution-style bullet wounds to his head. It was clear, this was no random act of violence. The Knoxville Police Department launched a massive search for Channon Christian. Time was critical. With every passing hour, hope of finding her alive faded. Her family, desperate and frantic, pleaded for answers. Then came a breakthrough. Officers found Channon's abandoned SUV parked several miles from where Chris had been found. Inside, they discovered something that would change the course of the investigation. Fingerprints. A match came back almost immediately. Lamarcus Davidson, a known criminal, a man with a violent past, a man who, just weeks before, had been released from prison. Authorities moved fast. A SWAT team assembled. Their target, 2316 Chipman Street. The house stood in eerie silence as officers surrounded it. Weapons drawn, they moved in. Bang! The front door was kicked open. Inside, the house was dark, the air thick with an unshakable stench of filth and death. They swept through the rooms, empty. Then, in the kitchen, something caught their eye. A trash can, taped shut. One officer reached for the lid, his hands trembling. He peeled it open, and there she was, Channon Christian. Her body twisted, lifeless. The room fell silent. Even the most hardened officers would later say it was one of the worst things they had ever seen. The house on Chipman Street wasn't just a crime scene. It was a tomb. Justice was coming, but for the families of Channon and Chris, it would never be enough. The trials were brutal, filled with graphic testimony that left the courtroom in stunned silence. The details of what had happened to Channon and Chris were almost too much to bear. Lamarcus Davidson, the ringleader, was sentenced to death. His half-brother, Latalvis Cobbins, received life without parole. George Thomas, life without parole. Eric Boyd, life without parole. And then there was Vanessa Coleman, the only woman involved. She hadn't just been there. She had written in her diary that the night had been an adventure. Her punishment? 53 years in prison. For Channon's family, it wasn't enough. Then came another gut punch. Years later, Coleman's sentence was reduced. It was another cruel twist in a case already filled with unbearable pain. For the families of Channon and Chris, no sentence could ever undo what was done. The case sent shockwaves across the nation, but not just because of its brutality. Some believe the media deliberately downplayed the crime. The reason? Race. Channon and Chris were white. Their killers were black. Some asked, if the roles were reversed, would the coverage have been different? The debate grew louder. Protests, editorials, heated discussions on national television. But while the world argued, Channon and Chris's families refused to be consumed by hatred. Instead, they focused on change. In Tennessee, new laws were introduced, ensuring tougher sentencing for crimes like this. And in the name of their children, Channon and Chris's parents created scholarships, helping others chase the future their kids never got to see. Channon and Chris weren't just victims. They were people. They were loved. They had dreams. We don't tell their story to glorify the horror. We tell it so that they are never forgotten. Rest in peace, Channon Christian and Christopher Newsom. If this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe for more true crime stories.